My name is Ed Finkler, and I'm going to talk about, it once was the MicroPHP Manifesto, and now it's the Microcode Manifesto, because I don't just do PHP so much anymore. But it really kind of came out of some stuff that I was working on. I did PHP for a long time, like still doing it, but well, 13 or 14 years. And it started off where I was really, how many of you guys work with PHP a lot? Like, let's say, so everybody's going to mostly understand that. So what I found was that where PHP was going, sort of like in terms of what kind of code people developed with it, what kind of libraries are out there, and stuff like that, and what I wanted to do seemed like they were going in different directions. You had a lot of like really big, heavy full stack frameworks, and there were lots of different sort of competing ones that are all doing different kinds of, they're sort of re-implementing their own kinds of things, re-implementing similar kinds of things in their own way. And all of them I found did more than I wanted them to do, and I did not want to have to spend the time learning all that stuff just to get some stuff done. I found myself working a lot. I do a lot of stuff with APIs, like HTTP APIs, and I found myself where what I really wanted was sort of a really base set of like, give me like a router and handlers and then session management or something like that, and I'll worry about the rest of that stuff. Things like database access stuff I wasn't really concerned about because I did not want to have that baked in necessarily. We were using different kinds of data stuff too that a lot of times it wasn't baked in. So I was sort of frustrated with this. I felt like where PHP was going and where I wanted to go were not going in the same direction. So I thought about this for a long time, and I wrote this thing called the MicroPHP Manifesto that was kind of based on, I kind of came up with the term because I really liked something that had happened in JavaScript a year or two ago, where with JavaScript you primarily have had a lot of sort of like these large, really, really big libraries that did a few different, some of them were full frameworks, I guess you'd say, but really, really big libraries like jQuery or Prototype or stuff like that. They did a bunch of different things. They do things like DOM manipulation and event handling and AJAX stuff and maybe some animation stuff and things like that. And all these, there were several different competing ones. And I think because of starting to do more mobile work, the size of these libraries, which was maybe sometimes 80, 90, 100K even when compressed, size became a really big issue in terms of doing mobile stuff. So there's sort of a movement to build these really small libraries that just did kind of specific things, like a very small event handler or a very small thing for doing AJAX requests, or a small thing that just did real simple, like a selector engine, so you could query the DOM, things of that nature. And I really liked that. I liked not having sort of big, heavy things that enforced a new way of learning on you. So, kind of based on that concept, I sort of adapted that a little bit to PHP. Wrote this manifesto kind of based on that. So I'm going to go through that. I modified it a little bit because it's not real. I don't think it really just applies to PHP. I do a lot of, like past probably 4 or 5 months, I've done a lot of Python code, which is the first time I've done a ton of that, and that was really scary at first because I was like, I've done this for like 13, 14, 15 years, and now I have to learn a whole new thing, and it's kind of scary to do that and be like, I have no clue what I'm doing. Imposter syndrome. And I've also done a lot of JavaScript too. Let's say, how many folks here have done a lot of, say, Python, or some Python, like develop Python apps or things like that? JavaScript? Okay, so a lot of people have worked with JavaScript. Are we Ruby folks here? Get out. Perl? I don't want to forget Perl.
Only when I have to.
Yeah, right? Yeah. There's surprisingly actually there's some good Perl, like good Perl web stuff out there.
I didn't know any better.
Yeah, right.
The only thing there.
Right at the time, yeah.
CGI bin.
Right. It's not like there's good stuff. It's not like 1995 Perl anymore. There's actually some really solid stuff. Is it Moose? Is that there's an object model thing called Moose, and then there's some anyway. But the point is, there's good stuff going on there. But the thing is, I really think these kind of concepts apply across the board. I think though, PHP. It makes sense that PHP was the thing that sort of started this brouhaha with me because I think PHP particularly was not doing well in these areas. So I'm going to go through the things that I wrote up and kind of talk about that stuff. I want to hear what you guys have comments, so please feel free to interrupt. Raise your hand, it would be helpful if you didn't just yell things out. But if I don't notice, you yell it out. So let's move on. So I wrote these four sort of statements and then expounded on them a little bit more. But the first statement I had was this one that says, I'm a web developer. And originally it said, I'm a PHP developer. And there was a point of this that I kind of wanted to get across here is that I guess the first thing is I like PHP and I also like Python pretty well. I like JavaScript pretty well. And I like making those things in those languages. So that's a statement that builds on that. I'm not a framework XYZ developer. I am not a Zen framework developer or a Symfony developer or a Cake PHP developer or a Django developer or a Rails developer. Or a jQuery developer. I have used most of those in one way or another. Well, not all of them, but I've used most of those. But I wouldn't consider myself like a developer specific to that framework, and there's a reason why I do that. I tend to think that when you learn these big stack frameworks, when I talk about a big stack framework, I'm talking about something that tries to include as much stuff as possible to anticipate the needs of a larger and ever-expanding group of people. And I'll get into maybe a little bit about why they do that, but usually it's because they're kind of building a business based on that. And they want to anticipate needs for as much stuff, so they kind of keep sticking things in there. I think when you get into this stuff where you're learning this big stack framework that does a bunch of things, I think oftentimes it's as complex as learning a new programming language. There's oftentimes, it forces you to learn a new nomenclature, new approaches to how you structure your code, or how you accomplish this task or that task, what have you. Now, it's a lot of times the similar things will have similar sort of goals to it, and it'll be kind of similar if you go from something like Zen framework to kind of MVC style stuff to say Cake PHP, MVC style stuff, and things like that. So there's definitely going to be some similarities in it. But I sort of find that you often get into a situation where you are learning and developing habits to develop in a particular language that isn't necessarily that if you just learn that one aspect, that doesn't necessarily make you really good at, say, as a pure language developer. I think one of the areas where you see this a ton is with jQuery, because there are lots of jQuery is incredibly popular. Like if you just look at usage across websites, jQuery compared to other sort of common libraries, jQuery is like 85-90%, and then other things are like single digit stuff, even particularly popular ones. So it gets used a ton, and there's just tons and tons of codes based on it. So knowing it is probably a good idea. But I think there's a lot of people out there who know how to just say develop and do stuff in jQuery, but if you ask them to say, okay, we'll break this down, and how would you do it? How would you just write some basic JavaScript that does this? It doesn't even need to be doing the same thing, like manipulating document object model or whatever, or something like that. But just understanding the core language, that understanding isn't very good, because they've really learned how to, it's sort of a pattern matching thing where it's like, okay, to accomplish this task, I put this stuff in there. And to accomplish this task, I put this stuff in there. And you kind of develop a method for you understand it within that context, of that jQuery context. But if you drop that stuff out and you have to do it on your own, then you're kind of up shit creek a little bit. So I kind of think that languages are complicated enough in a lot of cases. PHP is an interesting case because PHP really I think in a little ways, it's not, it certainly didn't start off as a general purpose language, or you can use it as that, but it is very optimized for a certain area, certain tasks. And it has a lot of stuff built into it that that framework sort of build upon, but for the sake of sort of making it more consistent with a particular aesthetic model that I think you see in PHP. But I mean, there's tons of stuff in PHP that we've all run into, things like inconsistent naming stuff and parameter order and sort of how things behave. Have you ever how many of you have ever worked with like trying to trap errors or exceptions in PHP consistently? So you know what I'm talking about.
Oh, heck, I wrote an extension to fix it.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That is a nightmare. And there's like 7 different ways to like turn it on and off. In certain cases, it won't work, and it's a real problem. You know, sort of incomplete implementations, like one of the things I always thought about, like I really fell in love with things like sort of functional coding style from JavaScript, and I really like that a lot. So things are kind of getting better, but PHP didn't start off with some of these things like functional code, like functional coding patterns, using namespaces. Like namespaces work really well in PHP if you write all your stuff object oriented. If you write procedural code or you use things like constants or stuff like that, you want to have that. That does not work so well. In a lot of cases, it just doesn't. It doesn't handle, say, procedural code at all. I think that PHP has really complex boilerplate for its object-oriented programming approaches, which I'm not a huge fan of, but that's another thing. Like a good example of it is like the differences between isSet and empty, those two methods, or those two functions and what they do. So I pick on PHP a little bit here. That's because I know it so well. But the point is that there are a ton of complexities in PHP, and to some extent I understand why there was this push for doing, say, big full stack frameworks that I think gave people basically a standard to kind of code against, and I really do get that. And I think that when you're first starting off with learning new languages and learning new approaches, it really is important to pick some standards and stick to them. A good example of that would be, as I've been writing a lot more Python code lately, there's a coding standard for Python that is effectively the official coding standard for Python called PEP 8. And PEPs are these sort of things that's like, we agree, there's sort of like an official, not an RFC, but an improved RFC, like after it's been seeded. That says this is what we intend to do as the Python group, which is, again, the structure of that is the complete opposite of PHP, like culturally. And so with PEP 8, it gets pretty specific. It's like you should have 2 lines between function definitions, not 3, not 1. If you should have 2, and it gets very specific about stuff. Some of that is kind of like, come on, bro, you know. But I'll tell you, I use an editor called Sublime Text, and there's a Sublime linter package, a plugin that you can get for that. And by default, and which makes sense because Sublime Text is really, it uses Python as its main scripting language. It has really good Python support for its automatic linting stuff. And so it uses the PEP 8 linter automatically against your code. Like every time you save it, it pops up. Actually, while I'm just typing, it will highlight stuff that says, you're doing this wrong, bro. And then it will, and then when you actually save it, it brings up some warnings that says, okay, on this line, this is wrong. This line, this is wrong. Now, sometimes that stuff is kind of like, trailing white space. But there's a couple things that did for me. One, I know it made me write better code and more readable code. And 2, it also catches things like syntax errors. Like there's a piece of code that just yesterday that one of our developers pushed up to Git and or pushed to our repo on GitHub And then I pulled it down, and I was like, nah, all my shit's broken. Why is this going on? And it turns out it's throwing a syntax error because he forgot to close the parentheses. And he knows what he's doing. It was just, you know, he just forgot to do it. And probably nothing that he ran was testing that code at the time. So you can tell we have a really good continuous integration system. And anyway, but the point is, like as soon as I opened that file up, I saw the Python warning said, oh, this file. As soon as the file opened up, the linter was like, this thing is wrong. This is a syntax error right here, right now. And it just told me, it's like, oh, okay, well, close it. Fix it. Hey, there we go. And now suddenly my stuff works again. So I think that it's important to follow certain practices, especially as you're learning stuff. But I think you kind of want to, there's a couple of things. I think as you start to grow and become more familiar with things, you want to be picky about what stuff that you decide to follow and what stuff you don't decide to follow. And I think, you know, so my feeling is that I'm comfortable with, like, I want to learn some basic, like, language level stuff about it. But I didn't necessarily want to say, when I started up with Python, okay, I need to learn the Django way of doing this stuff, or we do a lot of stuff with the Flask framework. I wanted to do the Flask way of learning this stuff. Now, sometimes that's helpful, and I definitely looked up and tried to get a lot of opinions on things. But ultimately, that's your decision, and you have to decide why you're choosing to do that. You have to have reasons for doing that other than just a bunch of guys said I should, or just some dude on the internet said I should. You know, that is not particularly, that's not a good argument for it, right? That's the second thing I said in this manifesto, as it were. And I said, I like building small things, and I do like building small things. I like building small tools that do stuff. I think small stuff is great. I think it's easier to understand and it's harder to screw up. And I am a big fan of understanding stuff and not screwing up. I screw up a lot. But, you know, I'm the kind of person where I will write like 3 lines of code, reload it, does it work? Write another like 2 lines of code, reload it, does it work? And inevitably, if I don't have a nice linter, I know in PHP it was constant syntax errors, forgetting semicolons, not closing, all over the place. It is a nightmare. And that's, you know, that's how I work, right? So I'm constantly making mistakes. But I think there's a fundamental thing is that it's easier to understand small pieces of stuff than it is to understand larger pieces. And I think to get to have a good grasp on why things work the way they do, you need to break them down into tiny pieces. So I like small things with simple purposes that, you know, if you're talking about, say, writing a class or a module that handles certain things or stuff like that, you want to really, like, you want to focus on it doing a certain small set of things, interrelated, or just one thing that it has to do well, and you can take that task and do that. Like, it's the difference between a JavaScript, like having, well, they talk about with jQuery that like the next major release they're going to break it out, so you just like, if I don't need the Ajax stuff, I'm going to drop that out. If I don't need like the selector stuff, you're going to drop that out. If I don't need the event stuff, you're going to drop that out. In a lot of cases, you probably do want all that stuff. But there's little, you know, there's tiny little, like, say, basic event handling things that are written like around that microjs.com website that are just, I mean, it's like 50 lines of code at most, and that's an event system for you. And it's like, what I need is an event system, and I want something I want to understand. Like, pull that in, and that's going to solve my problem for me. So I really like that approach of not trying to make a single thing do too much. I think your tendency is you're going to end up with sort of clashing stuff, and you're going to end up with things that you don't use. I like some of these self-contained pieces that solve individual problems. Really like that. And then you end up taking these small individual pieces that solve simple problems, and you have them work together to solve bigger problems. So each piece of this sort of setup that you might have is going to work with these other pieces to accomplish bigger things, right? You have an event model for a reason, or a little event library for a reason. Well, let's say you want to do, your basic idea is you want the user to be able to click on this button and have this action happen. Like, I don't know, something pops up at them, or they go to a different page or whatever. Well, there's a whole, you know, that event system serves the purpose of facilitating that action. So there's going to be other things that happen, like, okay, we need something that maybe like a templating library or something like that, so we can display stuff to the user or what have you. But I will say this, I think that fixing bugs is easier because you can look at each of these individual pieces and you can see what they're doing. It's easier to understand that. If you take that approach where you're sort of writing these pieces individually, your approach is going to be naturally to make stuff that is smaller, that is self-contained, and therefore I think it's going to be a lot more testable. That's another key thing. If you write stuff in the context of like a larger application, or just a larger system, I've consistently found that, at least I always write code that is harder and harder to test because it makes more assumptions about what's around it. There's always this balance of like how you're going to do that, and I think a lot of times it's easier to write stuff sort of in a white room that's easily testable, and then you go into the application, you end up writing stuff that's kind of all over the place. So that's always sort of the push and pull you have with application stuff. But I think with that larger context, you're more likely to write quality code and code that you can test better if you do this way. So this third piece of this manifesto here was, I really want less code. I think there's too much code, and I would like less of it. All right. Right? It's more code, more problems. You know. I absolutely think that's true. There's more shit that can go wrong the more code you have, and every single line of code adds to that.
But not the Perl way where you just make.
Well, you have to balance that. There's a balance, and I'll talk about it a little bit. There's a balance you must strike between, would this shit make any sense to anybody who is not a robot? And is it a bunch of it? I don't think, sometimes you want to be as verbose as you need to be so that other people can understand your stuff, but no more verbose, right? You want to make it as simple as you can, but maybe I should say it should be as straightforward as possible, right? That's what, like, here's a tiny example of this that got me on that. I really, really hate the ternary operator. Hate it. Because I think it is really hard to understand it. I think it sneaks into that, like, robot code kind of thing where it's like just some, magic glyphs and stuff, and it kind of reads like prompts. Magically, turn it. No, you write it out a little bit more, man. I mean, it works great if you are used to that and you've learned that, but it is so, there's a big difference between programming languages and natural language. But it is so far removed from, like, if this, then that. It is like, it's literally, it's like sort of like grunts. It's like, that's like what the ternary operator is, right? So, and every time, and I understand it, and I have even used it a couple times because I'm like, I really don't want to write this piece out, right? I have to look at it and think about it for about 5 seconds before I can tell what's going on. Every time. And yeah, there's people who get it, but I'm not sure on the larger scale that's a really great thing, right? Sorry, I have to go down and look at my notes here. So, I think bigger code bases get harder to manage, even on some basic level. Like, I do, a lot of the stuff that I have done over the years has been fixing or refactoring existing code bases. And so that is a sort of a dark art. I wouldn't even that is a dark art. And you learn certain techniques for getting around. And one of the things is that I am really, really good at being like, okay, this piece of code, what are all the different ways I can search for stuff to figure out where this function is defined? I'll pick up WordPress for a second. WordPress is terrible at that because it has this huge code base with like tons of procedural code in it, and it's very unclear as to where things are defined, right? So, you make function calls and you're like, well, where's this coming from? Like, this uses a plugin. Well, where does this plugin actually get loaded? Oh god, that is a nightmare to figure out. But as code bases get bigger, it is harder to apply that stuff. Simply it matters. If you've got 10 files to search instead of like 100 files or 1,000 files of like with big long code, it just takes longer physically. Now, the machines get faster and stuff like that, and that helps. But I'll tell you, like, one of the reasons I really like Sublime Text 2 is it searches shit really, really fast. And that's one of the reasons I switched off from TextMate a few years back from it. Because TextMate is, like, the built-in, grep across your project is very slow. So I'd be like, search, and go, get a sandwich and come back, and then hopefully it's done, right? I think that, and this affects different people differently, but things that bothered me are, like, navigating through complex file structures. It takes longer, and I don't like it. I don't like having to go, like, okay, open this directory, now open this directory, now open this directory, now open this directory, there's my file. Like, dude, come on. And sometimes there's a good reason for it, right? And there's a reason because they want to be strict about the naming conventions. And a lot of times, the naming convention is the placement. A lot of times, some things are just complex, and as you put them together into a larger application, you have to be, it's better than having like 500 files in one directory, right? But that stuff just bothers me. I'd really rather not have to mess with that stuff. Tracing through the execution of like dozens of files gets really hard. Like that, PHP is a guy, or excuse me, WordPress is a good example of that, but lots of other code. Python code, JS code, stuff like that. Tracing through the execution is really hard. And I just find that keeping it all straight in your head gets challenging the more code you have. And I think bigger libraries, more code, longer code, you start kind of overflowing your brain buffer. I remember somebody mentioned this, and I always like this. I really think, this is the thing I read. It said it was making a comment about sort of a coding standard that he was trying to enforce in this project. It said if it's over 200 lines, it's now officially unwieldy. And I kind of agree with that, because now, despite the fact that there's a lot of practical concerns that a lot of times stuff just gets over 200 lines, and that's fine, or whatever your standard is. I think that there's a reason why, for example, like phone numbers are the length that they are. Like they're 7-digit. Well, now everybody has 10-digit or more if you live in some other weird country. But in the U.S., they're 7 digits, and the reason is because there's I can't remember the exact numbers, but essentially people are able to remember things that are like, say, something like between 5 and 9 digits, and so there's a reason why they made 7. And the reason was because they found that people were able to remember, okay, that seems about right. So a higher number of people are going to be able to grasp that, because that's like this, there's, this is anecdotal, but I really think this is the case. There's probably somebody who's actually stated this in a paper or something, that your brain can handle certain chunks of information at certain lengths. And as it gets longer, and as there's things like more visual noise and it's difficult and stuff like that, it becomes more and more difficult to isolate it down into the pieces that you can chew on and you can understand. That's why I like white space. I'm a big fan of white space, and some people don't like that, but I really like white space, which is one reason I've been enjoying Python, because I really like, I think readability should be a feature, and that's very strongly enforced in Python. And that is, you have a certain limit in terms of how much information you can process at once, and that has to do with that brain buffer thing, but it also has to do with like visual cues we work on. There's a reason why we want things like consistent indenting, and we want things like having like key value assignments, why we like having them lined up. And there's a reason why we like things like syntax highlighting, to change things different color, to make it bold or italicized automatically or something like that. Because it makes it easier for us to process that as a different piece of information. It aids that. And those are all things, or things like code folding. I use code folding a lot. And I really like it because it's like, hey, suddenly I can get rid of all this crap and I can just look at like the names of the methods. And that's because when there's all this code in between stuff, well, practically speaking, on one level, I just can't see everything at once. But then it's also that I find it really distracting to be like, here's the definition name, and now here's a bunch of, you know, like stuff that's just spit out there, and and then I gotta scroll. It's distracting. It's more like background noise. It's this visual noise that messes with it. The more you can minimize that in your code, I think it becomes more accessible for people who are in different environments and different situations and stuff like that. So, having less code means you support less code, and that's key in a couple of ways. One is just issues of bugs. If you have less code, you're going to have less bugs. Really, seriously. And you know, I write tons and tons of bugs all the time. So if I wrote less code, I would have a lot less bugs. I mean, that's just pretty basic. Also, I mean, I talked about, I really think it's easier to test smaller pieces of code. It really is easier. The other thing is security, and this kind of gets into one of the things, the concerns that I've had with, I think, one of the concerns that I had when I was working on this and kind of thinking about it in a PHP context is that there's a lot of times where we bring in large, you know, where applications are built on top of large frameworks, and there's a ton of code in there that we might be hitting, say, in our execution, or it might be exposed in a way where it could be executed. But we don't really have, in this case, the developers don't really have any good understanding of why that code is there, or even if I need it, let alone is it a security issue. So every piece of code that you have in your code base, whether you wrote it or somebody else wrote it, you have to be, if it is part of your application, you have to be responsible for maintaining that. And, you know, if it's like, okay, how many of you guys have worked, like, say, on, like, for more than, say, a day, worked on a Drupal site or a WordPress site? Okay, yes, okay, so you've done that. Now, how many of you, I know in Drupal is like, you can't do anything without it. How many of you have used add-ons for Drupal or WordPress? Okay. Okay, how many of you have ever had to try to upgrade something for Drupal or WordPress or something like that because there was a security fix that maybe you heard about if you signed up for something, but maybe you didn't hear about, right? There was some image, I think there was like an image processing thing that was used in a ton of WordPress plugins. It was this piece of code that I think it would automatically sort of scale down images for you. And it turned out there was a security flaw in it, like a very clear exploit. So, and it was used in like hundreds of plugins. So there were just literally just like hundreds of thousands of sites, all exploitable. Because all of those plugin authors had just taken that code and said, "Oh, yeah, that's probably good," threw it in there, right? And didn't even, I guess, I mean, didn't even probably take the time to just sit down and read it. Right? I mean, I understand sometimes you may not anticipate a certain usage, and that's fine, and some people do that better than others. But clearly not even copying and pasting examples, having good examples. People do that shit all the time. I do that stuff when I was working on like Flash stuff, like for the first time in Python. I was like, well, this is exactly the code that I need, so I did that. And I tried to understand how it was working, right? But people do that because it's like, this accomplishes the task that I want. Shove it in there. And but I really think that's not a great situation to get into. But I think for just code that we're writing ourselves, not necessarily just pulling code off the shelf, I think when you're writing it, if you think of this, just imagine yourself explaining how your code works to another developer who's never seen it, and think about how long that would take, and like how many words you'd have to do, and how many things you'd have to reference back here. It's like, oh well, this thing, and you use this proxy object, you know, or how hard would that be? I don't know. I really like code that I can sit down and read it and say, oh yeah, I get how it works. And I didn't have to understand the context of how it executes in a larger system. Now there are some problems you have to solve that take that level of complexity. But I would say that especially in web development, which I think most of us are working in, most of these problems are stupid. They're really easy. Like they're small little problems. It's the issue of, the larger issues are like, how do I make this thing scale up beyond like 5 users? And how do I get it to do this or that? But to just accomplish the goal, like the stuff, there aren't a lot. Believe me, I was terrible at computer science. I got a minor in computer science in school, and I got C's like in all my classes. I don't remember anything from it. I don't know what an order and operation, I don't know what any of that shit means. I have classes at home that's like, that talks about B-trees and bubble sorts and crap like that. Nothing. Don't remember any of it. None of that stuff makes any sense to me. Well, I mean, I guess if I sat down, I've had people explain, it's like, oh yeah, I get that. Okay. Now I do. But none of that, and I've been doing this for like 15 years, and I have never had to know any of that stuff. Like, so the problems that you're solving are generally pretty, they're not complex algorithms, right? You don't have to be, you really don't have to be a computer scientist to do it. So I think we should really try to strive to write our code in ways that it is accessible, because most of the times these problems aren't as hard as you think. I think a lot of times we spend time trying to consider use cases that we ourselves are not going to use, or nobody else is going to use, and try to write code in that way. And my experience is that most of the time it doesn't work out like that, and makes things a lot harder. So I guess the kind of little mantra I take around from this is you have to justify every line of your code. And there has to be a good reason for it. There has to be. It doesn't mean that you don't ever have to use larger frameworks. You have to pull in larger applications. Look, there's a ton of stuff that is a total black box to me. I don't understand how web servers work. I don't know this. I guess I kind of understand it on a conceptual level, but I don't know how the internals work and how that source code stuff works. I mean, for the longest time, I guess I don't know. And I say web server, but like when the first several years I was working on like PHP stuff, it was like, I don't know, man. I just set up, I tell Apache to start, and then I sort of have to enable this PHP module, and now shit just kind of magically works. And if not, I just fiddle around with configuration options until it does, right? And I mean, I've learned patterns about like how to do that more efficiently, but realistically, I do not understand all that super well, the relationships between, say, Apache and mod PHP. I don't, because I don't do sort of lower level system stuff. My expertise is in higher level stuff, is in interpreted, scripting stuff, and things of that nature. That's what I'm good at. So there's a lot of stuff. MySQL, black box. I don't understand what really it's doing under the radar, and that's why there's people like you who are much, much, much smarter about it than I am. And I learned some things. I mean, when I was doing more like one man IT or web shop, I had to know that stuff. So I had to learn a lot of stuff about like, well, how do I performantly configure Postgres or MySQL, or how do I performantly configure Apache or things of that nature. So I did that a lot, but I certainly wouldn't say that I had a deep understanding of it. So there's going to be these black boxes in all cases. But the stuff that you do know, that you're fairly comfortable with, you really need to justify every line of code that you're using. One thing that I really think is really important, and I think a lot of people don't do this, is and it's easier. It's kind of a little bit harder in PHP, but you can do it with free tools. I use NetBeans and Xdebug, the Xdebug extension. Step through your code, and like that is how I learned how a lot of like code bases I had no familiarity with. How are they working? What's the execution path and stuff like that? You have to just make a request and like go through and step through each thing. It's like, okay, this is what's happening. Oh, it's loading up these libraries here. Oh, it's doing this and doing that. A lot of times a code base where if I just sat there and it's just this expansive wasteland of stuff I did not write and have no familiarity with. It sort of makes more sense now if I do that. But they're I say in PHP particularly, and part of that I think is the tooling stuff. Lots of people, I'm curious, how many of you step through your code to debug stuff? Like on a pretty regular basis?
Depends on the code.
Right, yeah, depends on the code, yeah. So like with PHP stuff.
Still depends on the code.
Right, and I still, because it's kind of a pain in the ass with PHP to like, because I don't use, say, NetBeans as my regular IDE or my regular editor, so I have to bring up NetBeans, and I have to, it was 6 months ago that I did this, and now I have to get it working again and stuff like that. There's a tool, There's a new OS X tool that it's a little expensive, but it looked like it worked pretty nicely, called CodeBug, I think it is. That looked like it might be kind of good. It's like a standalone step debugger. If you do JavaScript, how many of you have stepped through JavaScript code that executes on your system? Okay. But a lot of you have written it, right? You know there's a step debugger in every single browser that you can get. I use the step debuggers in JavaScript every single day of my job. Every time I touch any JavaScript code, I am using it. Because if you think that debugging, like sequentially executing code, like in PHP is hard, now imagine everything's asynchronous and event-driven, and you can call all sorts of shit all over the places at any given time. I will go in there and I'll open up WebKit Inspector or Firebug, and it'll have breakpoints set from like 200 breakpoints set from some other time that I set. I set it up 6 months ago. Sometimes my code will stop executing. I'm like, what the fuck is that? And then it's like, oh no, it's up on a breakpoint that I used like 2 weeks ago. There's a nice thing in Chrome now where it says paused in debugger, like in the browser, because otherwise you're like, why isn't anything happening? All the time, you just have to. You have to do that. And like as I wrote on top of the Python stuff, I was also learning how to write a more complex application with the backbone libraries in JavaScript, and it really, really, really helped me understand how they worked by stepping through their code and seeing, oh, this is how they're doing extension, like how they're extending stuff, so you can do sort of you do an inheritance model with it. This is what it's doing. This is why it's calling this event at this time. This is why it's triggering this stuff. Otherwise, you're just like, I don't know, this magic happens, and then if I type this in, it just magically does that for me, so it's fine. And yeah, if you just want to, if you learn stuff that way, that's fine, but you're not going to have sort of a deeper understanding of how these things are put together. Please, go ahead.
Yeah, so you're talking about that and like, how you want to have a deeper understanding.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about how when you use jQuery, you don't have a deeper understanding of JavaScript. I'm kind of playing the devil's advocate here, but
yeah.
How's that different than not understanding what's going on with Apache or underneath PHP, or not understanding how MySQL? Like, what's your litmus?
That's a good question. No, that's a really good question. I think it's a little. I think it's different because it's not such a. I would say it's a degree of difference, and it's different in the sense that jQuery is running in that same environment, I guess, that JavaScript interpreter environment, and I think that that's one thing, but I think it is likely that you can, like in that case, it is likely that you're going to run into cases where jQuery is not available to you because that's not part of your default environment. Now, it often is brought in there, but I think the example of what ended up pushing a lot of people, I think, to why they sort of had this thing where let's use a bunch of the little smaller libraries, was because they had to because of loading times on mobile. Otherwise, it really wasn't that huge a deal. And so that's what sort of pushed people I think, to kind of get into that more. Otherwise, there wasn't necessarily a compelling reason to always be like, oh, I'll just include jQuery with it. It's fine. I think it's getting in that so when you run into areas where you don't have it, or where you run into and there's things that compel you to not make it available. Those are usually performance issues. So. Now, jQuery as it gets developed has optimized a lot of stuff, but there's a lot of code in jQuery, just again focusing on that particular issue, that is designed to do a bunch of different stuff to, like, say, support certain browsers and things like that. That in your case you might not care about supporting. Like, I guarantee you, like the Ajax code in jQuery is as big as it is because they have to support IE6, and there's tons of selector stuff in their selector engine. And doing different kinds of events and stuff is because they're trying to mock up stuff that works better in older browsers that don't support things. You're getting to a point where, like, if you just took IE10 and you took current Firefox and you took current Chrome, they're pretty good in terms of just not being brain dead or just like supporting sort of similar stuff. But when you drop back into that, there's just tons of that stuff that jQuery has to do, because they've said, we want to support IE6. And that's great, but that's their intent there. If that's not what you need in your application, that would be a reason why you want to pull that down. Sometimes it was just a matter of we could take code that was just slower in jQuery, and if we wrote it closer to the metal, which is the JavaScript interpreter and the APIs that are exposed by the browser, we were able to get stuff more performant. And that's not always just like, well, if you're doing like thousands of things at a time or stuff. It's stuff like cutting down on loading times for something where maybe you're setting, like we had a thing on the website that we work on, Gimme Bar, where it was loading up. It would have to load jQuery to insert this toolbar at the bottom of your site, and you could pull things off the web page and drag them onto there, right? Well, if you're loading up jQuery, that's 100K of code, and then if we do everything in jQuery, that is going to be a bit slower. So to be performant about it, we had to write stuff. We had to say, okay, I'm going to ditch that, cut out our loading times, and make stuff execute faster. So that's probably the biggest reason, is that like you probably want to have a decent enough understanding where if you had to say drop these libraries out, you could still do it, right? You have to be realistic about it too. Like if you don't have the expertise in house to do X, Y, Z, that might not be great. I mean, like, but that would be why in this case. And so I would consider something like Apache that it moves into a whole different sort of realm where it's not just, oh, I'm just optimizing stuff. That's like, this is doing things that I fundamentally don't have a really great understanding of and could not delve into and edit it, especially because a lot of those things are usually written with compiled code and stuff like that. That sort of changes a bunch of stuff, right? So that's what I'd say about it. Yeah. Okay, so I better kick this crap in gear. I really like simple. This is my fourth thing. I like simple, readable code, right? And I kind of touched on this some more, but I want code that's easy to understand. I really believe that if you can read something and get what it's doing quickly right off the bat, and you don't have to kind of be like, oh, so it's doing this, and then it's not. If you understand things quickly, it means you get stuff done faster. Your time to productivity is shortened because you don't have this kind of learning curve. That's the thing that drove me nuts, because I was like, I want to do this kind of application, but I don't want to have to learn a whole bunch of processes about how to set that up. And a lot of these, you can be a jQuery developer and not really understand, say, JS. You could be a Rails developer and not really understand Ruby. You could be a Django developer and not really understand Python. I think Python's just by nature is a little bit easier to get, but it's still that way. And you could certainly, if you went in there and just like said off the bat when you were learning PHP, you just learned, I don't know, like Symfony, well, you would understand how to code in Symfony. But if you drop Symfony out of there, would you be able to do a lot of stuff? I think it would be really hard to do. So I think, and you just have this learning curve, right? So that time to productivity from when I have this library and I understand how it works and then I get stuff going, that is greatly shortened if you can read it and get it out of the box. And your time to fix bugs is shortened a ton too. When you find a problem with your code, something's going wrong, if it's easier to understand, it's going to be easier for you to figure out why things are happening and why this thing went wrong. I want code that's easy to verify. And I talked about this before. I think it should be more testable. And I really think simpler code is more testable. Yeah. So I kind of get into this. I don't know how much time we have. How much time do we have? Like a minute?
About 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay. So I kind of talked about this a little bit with where web dev is going, but I think a lot of this is stuff that I think people kind of get. My tendency to think is that, and a lot of this stuff focused on server-side languages. I talked to someone about, JS, but server-side languages like Python and Ruby and PHP. And I think what you're seeing, although it depends on the situation, it really depends on what the needs are of the users. I think that what you're seeing is that presentation and UI stuff is really being handled by the client. So that means that's happening inside the browser. And that's changed because I think that the clients are now powerful enough to do that. I would say primarily because of optimization of JavaScript execution. That has made it possible for you to do things like have templating libraries execute on the client side instead of the server side. I think sort of the optimum model, and this doesn't work out as well as it would, but I think you're finding that you sort of do as little as possible in terms of UI stuff on the server, or at least I tend to find that. That can vary based on what the needs of the needs of the users are. If the users are like only using feature phones or something like that, and that's what you're pushing out, that's going to be a harder thing to do. You can't tell them, oh yeah, download this templating library and we'll write it all in Mustache. That's not going to be good for them. So I think that what it means is that in a lot of cases, server-side languages end up being glue between different systems. And so what I found in the last few applications I've written is that we've tried to take sort of an API-centric model where we have basically you have your data store and that's wrapped inside of an HTTP API, and that sits here. And then you have different clients that chew on that. When I say clients, one of the things I'll talk about is one of those clients could be a front-end web application. Now, typically that front-end web application is going to have both a server and a client-side component to it, right? So, but it's going to talk to the API. But you're also, and so there's going to be server-side stuff here to handle things like sessions. I think the biggest thing that you have, why you still need a server-side component in a front-end web app, is because you need is for security sake. Because if you have the browser, you don't want to do things like store session cookies, or not session cookies. You don't want to store things like, I don't know, application keys for access to the API. You don't want to store those in the browser. It ends up being really easy to pull that stuff out. So there's basic stuff where that in the best of times, that server-side aspect of the front-end web app basically just bootstraps up all the client-side stuff. So it gives a real simple template, serves up the JavaScript libraries, and then tells it kick it off. And then it does. Then basically everything goes through there. And it usually provides a proxy for the API stuff, again, to handle like session management. To say, are you actually a person who should be able to check this stuff or not, right? Doing CSRF protection and stuff like that. So it handles those kinds of things. The API thing is really the big thing, and that stuff is really, that's, for the most part, that's glue stuff and application logic that handles like getting data out of the data store and then formatting it in a way that's easily parsable. So usually, we do pretty much stuff all in JSON, and when you hear Ben talk about it, the HTTP stuff he's talking about, that's the kind of stuff we're doing. He's the guy who came up with the REST approach. What's that dude's name? Yeah, well, he'd probably be mad at some of the stuff that we do, but for the most part, trying to kind of basically follow this kind of principle. So you've got this API, but then you also could have something like a compiled application that's running on other systems. Like it might be a native application on Android or iOS, and that's doing the same thing as pulling that API stuff. It has a different kind of security model, so you don't necessarily need that server-side thing. There's a few cases where you might end up having to, for practicality's sake. You might have a desktop application that's running on OS X or Windows 8, the same kind of thing. And so you end up breaking this stuff out like that. And all these pieces are smaller because of it, right? And what we found with that model is that there's a ton of stuff we end up tossing out. Performance is a huge issue here. So typically we're not going to take a heavy ORM layer. And also, most of the time we write stuff against things like MongoDB or pushing stuff up, at the same time when it gets, something gets inserted, we push it out to like an Elasticsearch server or something like that to handle those kinds of things. And so that kind of stuff, a heavy ORM or something that lets us like treat Postgres and MySQL and Oracle and SQL Server and stuff like that all the same, that is irrelevant to us. Now it might be relevant to some other people, but that is decidedly irrelevant to what we're doing. So we just strip all that crap out, right? So all it's really doing is, it's not doing, like with PHP in particular, this is different. PHP's initial execution model and the way that you still have to wrap stuff in PHP tags is it was designed to be a little macro language that was stuck inside of HTML. And so the results of it were designed to be pushed out for the most part. And it in and of itself was a macro or templating language. Well, we don't use any of that stuff anymore, or we use it very, very minimally. I mean, like on our Flask applications and the front end thing, we do really basic stuff where we set up, we use Jinja, which is built into the Flask, which Jinja is just a templating language in Python. So the only time we use it is to build the base template that's a very plain HTML skeleton and inject a few variables into it, and then it serves it up. So that's all we do with it. All the rest of the stuff is not relevant to us. So a lot of the sort of classic, particularly PHP full stack frameworks, there is tons of crap we don't use in there. We're not using their ORM. We're not using their templating stuff. At that point, it's like security stuff and routing, route handlers. That's all we do with it anymore. So I think that's a general change, and I think that's an architecture works well for us. Your situation is going to be dependent on the client, but generally what I think is you have that sort of structure. You're going to have different clients build off of that, and really what those server-side languages do is they're gluing things together. And so tons of stuff that you used to worry about now, you do not care about. Quickly, just a couple examples of some things I wrote in PHP. FUnit is a unit testing thing that I wrote because I did not like. It's not like I didn't like PHP Unit. Everybody uses PHP Unit, I guess. But PHP Unit is an example of an application that works really well and is very powerful. But it also, I think, because it tries to do bunches of things for different cases, it becomes very complex. And I just wanted, if you've ever looked at like QUnit, FUnit was really based on QUnit, at least conceptually. QUnit is the thing that the jQuery guys developed, but it's not just jQuery. You can use it for all sorts of testing. It's very straightforward. It's like you write a function, start your test. Okay, if this, then it's sort of like JUnit style, like assert true, blah, write, end it. That's it. And I didn't have to load up a bunch of stuff. I didn't have to write out stub libraries. I didn't have to load any XML crap up or anything like that. I didn't have to write out a bunch of classes. I just wrote this thing, and I just wanted to test it, and I just wanted it easier and a little simple report, and that was it. Resty.php, I had to call it .php because there are like 1,000 things named Resty. Or always remember to Google stuff before you name it. Resty is a real simple layer where we had a situation where I can't even remember why now, but we didn't ever install the curl library on our stuff at Gimme Bar because we were worried about it, I guess. So we had to use streams, HTTP streams, to do HTTP stuff to like talk to it. And holy shit, that sucks. It works fine, but it is a nightmare of an API. So
Blame Sarah and Les.
yes, well, I'm sure it makes sense to them. And well, and it works on the basic stream thing too, which is not. It doesn't. Conceptually, it's so different from the HTTP model. That's the thing. So you have to do a bunch of setup to get it to work. Pass it like these big arrays of options and stuff like that, and then make your execute stuff, and then pull back the results. And it's hard to get results out, and you have to like parse the headers out individually, and so it's very low level. So basically, I wrote a wrapper based on that, so it doesn't require curl, and it's really easy to call stuff. So you can just be like resty get, and then give it a URL. And then if you want to, you can pass it some parameters, and then it retrieves stuff for you. The idea, it's not big. It does the basic things that you want to do if you're interacting with most HTTP stuff. And in our case, it was really so that our front-end application, our PHP side of our front-end application, could talk to our API, and we could write that code more easily. So that's another thing you could check out. That sort of shows that. Okay, and then that's the end. There's a couple things you could check out. I sort of started doing this thing called microphp.org, where I kind of listed out some libraries of like sort of smaller modular libraries that I liked. I do think that having better tools is helping with that. With Zen Framework and Symfony 2, Zen Framework 2 and Symfony 2 have both gone towards a more modular approach where you don't necessarily have to rely on having the whole thing, which I think is good. And I think the use of, more use of tools like Composer, I think, has helped people think about writing libraries in a modular way, and I really like that. And so that's getting a little bit better. So I work for a company called Fictive Kin. You can check out what we do there. And a lot of this code I wrote while I was thinking about and writing stuff on GimmeBar, if you want to check that out. And then devhell.info is a podcast that I do with a guy named Chris Hartjes. So if you're interested in that, that'd be awesome. So I don't know how much time we have left. 0 time. So that's pretty much it. But thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. And I guess that's it.